Now Dr. Howard C. Estep is ready to begin his 28th message from the book of Genesis, starting with chapter 30, verse 37.
If you'll turn in your Bibles to the book of Genesis, chapter 30, beginning in verse 37, and then we go through chapter 31 and conclude with verse 29. I have a lesson outline for you. The rest of chapter 30, beginning in 37 through 43, is called Tampering with Nature. That's the latter part of that chapter, one section, Tampering with Nature. That will conclude chapter 30. Then we move to chapter 31, and we have four parts in the lesson at this hour. 1, jealousy of Laban's sons, chapter 31, verses 1 through 10. Laban's sons became real jealous. Number 2, Jacob's call back to Canaan. That's verses 11 through 13. And 3, Jacob's journey to Canaan, verses 14 through 21. And lastly, number 4, Jacob pursued by Laban, but protected by God, verses 22 through 29. So that's the lesson outline for this hour. We move now into the concluding part of chapter 30. Beginning in verse 37, we have tampering with nature. And verse 37 says, And Jacob took him rods of green poplar and of the hazel and chestnut tree, and pilled white strakes in them. Pilled. This is an old English word. He peeled the bark off. And he peeled it off so that it would have the effect of the old barber, revolving barber stick outside the barber shop, if you know what I mean. He peeled or pilled strips of bark down, and he gave it the appearance of rattan furniture type effect. The middle of verse 37, and pilled white strakes in them, and made the white appear which was in the rods. And he set the rods which he had peeled before the flocks in the gutters in the watering troughs when the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. And the flocks conceived before the rods, and brought forth cattle ring-straked. Now look this ring-straked up. This is an old English phrase, straked, and this word straked means streaked, ringed, curls, straked. There was a curly streak in the hair formation of the various animals, is what he's saying here. The middle of verse 39, and brought forth cattle ring-straked or ring-streaked, speckled and spotted. And Jacob did separate the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the ring-straked and all the brown in the flock of Laban. And he put his own flocks by themselves and put them not into Laban's cattle. Now what we're doing here, we're following this man Jacob, because you will remember he had worked some 14 years for these two women, for his uncle, and he was wondering, what am I going to get out of this? Because he now has a number of children by the two wives and the two maids of the two women, and he has a large family, and he's wondering, how am I going to pay my way? How am I going to support my wives and my children later on in life? And so he got involved in a bargain back in our last lesson, because he entered into a contract. And if you will notice in verse 32, we're just digressing shortly, I will pass through all thy flock today, removing from thence all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle among the sheep, and the spotted and the speckled among the goats, and of such shall be my hire. So he's picking out certain animals that he is going to claim for himself. And he's going to segregate his animals in a certain part of the pasture land or the grazing land. Now we find him doing this over here in 37 through 43. And you'll notice in verse 41, and it came to pass, whensoever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. Now we don't know all the details about this. Some of this could be superstition. Some of it could be just pure hearsay. But evidently God blessed Jacob because Laban had taken advantage of Jacob. And God is going to bless Jacob because He promised to bless him through Abraham, through the Abrahamic covenant. But He did bless him. And verse 42 says, and when the cattle were feeble, He put them not in where his cattle were. When a sickly, runty looking sheep or goat or cattle came along, He didn't claim that. He left that for his uncle. He didn't take that. He had an eye for business. So the feebler were Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. And the man increased exceedingly and had much cattle and maidservants and men servants and camels and asses. Now Laban was an unjust and covetous man, and his treatment of Jacob from the first was shameful. There was no ground for this jealousy, for he was greatly enriched through Jacob, who had been the means of raising Laban's family to importance as compared to former times. When Jacob came along, Laban was just an ordinary sheep herder. Had goats, sheep, and a few cattle. But this man Jacob rolled up his sleeves, as it were, and he began to become very industrious for his uncle. He worked very diligently. He evidently understood the science of agriculture and animal husbandry, and he increased the flocks. And then when he had increased his uncle's flocks to a tremendous number of animals, then he began to wonder, what am I getting out of this? What am I going to get out of this? And that's when he got the idea, I will take the spotted and the brown and the ring-straked, etc., and I will put them over to one side, and they will be my animals. And then he got the idea of peeling off the bark off of the trees, and for some mysterious way, which is not explained in Scripture, that when these animals were in heat and they were mating, that they would produce animals who were spotted and ring-straked and such. And evidently they did, because God blessed Jacob, because you'll notice there in verse 43, it says, and the man increased exceedingly. He had much cattle and maidservants, men servants, and camels and asses. So he had lots of animals. Evidently, God blessed him. And God blessed him in a very wonderful, marvelous way. Now we move into chapter 31, and we have the jealousy of Laban's sons. The uncle of Jacob, the sons of Laban, they become very jealous. This is verses 1 through 10. Verse 1 says, and he heard the words of Laban's sons saying, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's. Well, that's not really true. They're just jealous of Jacob because he is being blessed of God. And when God blesses you, there's really no excuse, no explanation for it. God blesses, and you have, and you get an abundance, and things happen in your individual life, maybe in your own body, and people just can't explain it. And that was what was happening to Jacob, and the sons of Laban were very jealous about it, and they said, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's. Going back to verse 43, where he had increased exceedingly with much cattle, maid servants, manservants, camels, etc. And so the sons of Laban are saying, well, this man is just taking these things that belong to our father. Notice what it says, the latter part of verse 1. And of that which was our father's hath he gotten all this glory. Verse 2, and Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before. And that's so true. It's amazing what the countenance will do. You can have an argument with someone, and their countenance changes just like that. Maybe your countenance or my countenance changes also. But Jacob noticed that his uncle wasn't the happy, smiling, carefree, prosperous-looking cattleman that he was prior to what happened in verse 43. Because he says in verse 42 that Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before. He wasn't friendly wise as he was before. He wasn't kind and jovial and seemingly that brotherly, maternally instinct that he had for him prior to this. Now verse 3 says, And the Lord said unto Jacob, it's rather interesting, in the days before God raised up prophets to speak to his people, he himself spoke directly to them and revealed his will. We have records of this in the Old Testament where God spoke to men directly. God spoke through prophets and through his word, and today he speaks through his word to us. But in those days, God just spoke to people directly. God spoke to Moses at the burning bush, you well remember, when God told him to take off his shoes. And God said, you tell him when you go down into Egypt that I am hath sent you. So God spoke to Jacob, and the Lord said unto Jacob, Return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee. What's he talking about? Return unto the land of thy fathers. He's going back to the land of Canaan, back to the promised land. Go back to the land that I promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the Abrahamic covenant, starting in the 12th chapter of Genesis, also in the 15th chapter of Genesis, the 17th chapter of Genesis, confirmed in Isaac, confirmed in Jacob. God said, go back to the promised land. Why? Because God's full promise to the seed of Abraham was only to come to them while they were in the promised land. Anytime they got out of the promised land, they never received the full and the complete blessing. The blessing was only in its fullness while they were in the promised land. So God is saying to Jacob, go back. Go back to the promised land. Return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee. And Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field unto his flock. These are his two wives. He's had a dialogue with God, conversation with God. Now he calls his two wives out. He wants to talk the matter over with them. He's out in the field tending the flock according to verse 4. So he signals his two wives to come out. Evidently they go out in verse 5 and said unto them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not toward me as before. That's rather interesting, because this conduct of Jacob is an admirable example of domestic management. Rather interesting. As husband and father, he had the right to decide upon his own plans for the family, but instead of exercising that right, he wisely called his wives and revealed his plans to them, obtaining their full cooperation. Smart husband. Talked it over with his wives. He said to them, God's been talking to me. God's directed me to go back to my home. You remember he left his home 20 years previously when his brother had threatened to kill him. His brother said, I'll kill him. And so Jacob took flight, went away, stayed away for 20 years. So now he's got to go back to the land of his fathers. The middle of verse 5 says, But the God of my father hath been with me, verse 6, and you know that with all my power I have served your father. He's talking to his two wives. With all my power I have served your father. I've been faithful. I've been honest. I've been a good worker. I've taken care of his cattle, his goats, his sheep. I've had his interest at heart at all times. That's what he's saying in verse 6. Verse 7 says, And your father hath deceived me. That's rather a harsh statement to make to these two women who are his wives, because he's saying to his two wives, your father's a crook. He's not to be trusted. He's a schemer. He'll skin the eyeballs right out of your sockets if you allow him. He hath deceived me and changed my wages 10 times. Changed my wages 10 times. But God suffered him not to hurt me. Evidently, Jacob still had this spark of godliness in him, because you remember when he had the dream, the vision of the ladder standing on the earth and reaching up to heaven, he saw angels coming down and going back up, and then God talked to him, and then he awakened from his dream, and then he built an altar out of the stones which he had been sleeping with, using as a pillow. He built an altar, and there he praised God, and evidently the Bible says he poured oil over the stones, and he had some kind of a religious service. And he praised God. Now this spark of godliness is coming back in him, and during all of this 20-year sojourn working for his uncle, he has been an honest, upright, faithful employee, and he's never connived. And now he's gotten to the point, he says, where I'm going to leave. God's told me to leave. And he tells his uncle he's going to leave, and something happens. Verse 8. If he said thus, and he's saying to his two wives, comparing what their dad said to Jacob, verse 8, if he said thus, the speckled shall be thy wages, then all the cattle bear speckled. That's rather interesting. See, God has the ability to bless under all circumstances. Jacob says, it's rather interesting, this verse 8. If he said thus, the speckled shall be thy wages, then all the cattle bear speckled. Why? God wanted to bless Jacob. Notice the rest of that verse. Then all the cattle bear speckled, and if he had said this, or said thus, the ring straight shall be thy hire, then bear all the cattle ring straight, or ring streaked. You see, God can cause the animal in the womb of the mother animal to be whatever God wants it to be. If God wants it ring streaked, or he wants it brown spotted or white spotted, or if he wants it, whatever he wants, God can do. Because God has that ability. Man does not have that ability. I'm amused sometimes when I see the scientists playing with the genies, and they're trying to devise human life, and they're doing all kinds of things. But you must go down to bare facts. God giveth and God taketh away. All life comes from God. A man may tamper with things such as Jacob tampered with nature in chapter 30, verses 37 through 43. But God has the power to multiply and to bless under all circumstances. And this is what Jacob is telling the two women here. Notice in verse 10, and it came to pass at the time that the cattle conceived, that I lifted up mine eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which leaped upon the cattle were ringed straight, speckled, and grizzled. In other words, what he's saying, when he set aside this type of animal that was marked in a certain way, he's saying to these two women, I didn't have anything to do with it. In a sense, he did, but really he didn't. It just looked superstitious that he did what he did about peeling off the bark of trees and putting these rods with the bark half peeled at the watering troughs and all of that, thinking that when they came down to drink of the water, this would cause the baby animal in the mother to have rings straight, etc., etc. But it was God who did all of this. And this is what he's saying here in the latter part of verse 10. And behold this dream, and behold the rams which leaped upon the cattle were ringed straight, speckled, and grizzled. So there we have Laman's sons very, very jealous in verses 1 through 10. Why? Because of God's blessing. When a person isn't saved, when a person isn't a true child of God, and they don't have this inner faith to really trust and believe that God can do all things, then they get a little bit jealous of the Christian. When the Christian seemingly has no outward connections, but yet God blesses in a magnificent way. It's wonderful. Jacob had that inner divine faith, and he trusted God. Now we move into his call back to Canaan in verses 11 through 13. And the angel of God spake unto me in a dream, still talking to his two wives, saying, Jacob, and I said, Here am I. And he said, Lift up now thine eyes, and see all the rams which leap upon the cattle are ringed straight, speckled and grizzled. For I have seen all that Laban doth unto thee. That makes me think of one verse. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. Isn't that nice? We Christians don't have to get even with anybody. Haven't you heard people say, I'll get even with him, you just wait and see. We don't have to get even with anybody. If anybody gets even with anybody, God will do it. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. Notice what it's doing here in the middle of the latter part of verse 12. For I have seen all that Laban doth unto thee. God sees. The Bible says that the eyes of the Lord are open. The ears of the Lord always are hearing. God knows everything that's going on. Nothing is hid from God. The eyes of God beholdeth all mankind. Nobody's getting away with anything. God sees everything. You may say you got a dirty deal down at the plant, the factory where you work. God saw it. God will get even when the time comes, if it's necessary to get even. You don't have to worry. God got the ability to see all of these things. And here the latter part of verse 12 confirms all of that. For I have seen all that Laban doth unto you. Verse 13. I am the God of Bethel. He's referring Jacob back to his dream. When at Bethel, where Jacob had the ladder, then he built the altar, then he poured the oil over the rock formation. He had conducted a religious service, and he named the place Bethel. God is in this place. Notice what it says here in verse 13. I am the God of Bethel, where thou anointest the pillar. That's where he poured the oil on the rock. And where thou vowest a vow unto me. Now what vow did he vow unto him? We just keep your finger there. But go back to chapter 28, verse 22. And you'll get the vow that he made. He made a vow at Bethel, beginning in verse 22. And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give thee the 10th unto thee. Why God blessed him in verse 43 of chapter 30 was because of the vow that Jacob made in 28 verse 22. In 28 verse 22, he said, God, you bless me, and I'll give you 1/10 of everything I produce. And then we see in verse 43 that evidently God did that. Because in verse 43 of chapter 30, the man increased exceedingly, had much cattle and maidservants and men servants and camels and asses. He had all kinds of animals. And now here he's ready to go back to Canaan, and he's not going to go back broke, a hobo, a wandering Bedouin. He's going to go back a rich man, wealthy. Lots of hired servants are made. These are actually slaves, women servants, men servants, animals, plenty of animals, all kinds of animals, all colors of animals. And that must have been a victorious march when he went back into Canaan. And his relatives saw him coming, because when he left, he didn't have anything. He just had it tied up in a bandana handkerchief, tied to a pole, hung over his shoulder. A hobo, more or less, hightailing it out of town. But now he comes back in very wealthy. And people look at him when he starts coming back. I'm jumping ahead of the lesson. But I can see them as they see this herd of cattle and sheep and goats and this great crowd of people coming. And they said, who is this? And they said, don't you remember? Remember what? This man Jacob had a falling out with his brother. And his brother was going to kill him. And Jacob ran, got away from the locale. He's been gone for about 20 years. God's evidently blessed him. Look at all of this that he's got with him. God has the ability to bless. In the middle of verse 13, and where thou vowest a vow unto me, now arise, get thee out from this land, and return unto the land of thy kindred. So Jacob's call to go back to Canaan is in verses 11 through 13. Now he makes a journey in verses 14 through 21 as he leaves this area where his uncle Laban is situated, where he has labored for over 14 years, where he has 2 wives, 2 concubines. He's raised almost 2 families. He has this extreme amount of cattle. Now he's journeying on his way to Canaan, beginning in verse 14. And Rachel and Leah answered and said unto him, Is there yet any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? I think, now I may be wrong, but I think that the women kind of got sore at their own father because they saw that the old man wasn't honest. He wasn't up above board. You couldn't really trust him. And because they asked the question here, Rachel and Leah answered and said unto him, Is there yet any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Is there anything in our father's house that we could use? Is there something there that belongs to us? Because they're going to go with their husband and their children. They're going to go into this land of Canaan. They're not going to stay there. So they're wondering, what do we have in the house that belongs to us? Looking at verse 13, are we not counted of him strangers? Are we not counted of him strangers? What they're saying, doesn't he treat us just like a bunch of strangers? Even our own father doesn't treat us like we're his daughters. He treats us like we're strangers. He must have had a cold-blooded eye for money. He must have been looking for the highest interest wherever he could get the best deal. Even his daughters are complaining against him. They're saying here, For he hath sold us, and hath quite devoured also our money. He sold us. He got the dowry for us. He worked our husband for 14 years. We didn't get anything out of it. Our father commercialized on us. They're getting sore at him by the minute. Look what it says in verse 16. For all the riches which God hath taken from our father, that is ours, and our children's. Now then, whatsoever God hath said unto thee, do it. In other words, we're behind you. We're behind you, Jacob. Whatever God has told you to do, do it. Well, there's a good Sunday morning text, isn't it? That's beautiful. Whatsoever God hath said unto thee, do. Isn't that beautiful? Well, you could spit in a bulldog's eye with that text, I'll tell you there. You got all the authority you need right there. So they say to him, let's go. Let's get going. Verse 17. Then Jacob rose up and set his sons and his wives upon camels. See, he was a rich man. He had a lot of camels. So he loads up the camel train. Isn't this beautiful? That's the Cadillac of the desert before they had the four-wheel drive over there. The camel's got that nice soft ride and a steady gait, you know. And when you get into the movement of the thing, it's kind of nice. And a good, comfortable saddle to sit in. It's like sitting in a chair. And they're going to ride this camel across the desert. So they load him up on the camels, verse 18, and he carried away all his cattle and all his goods which he had gotten, the cattle of his getting which he had gotten, and Padan Aram, for to go to Isaac his father in the land of Canaan. He wanted to go see his father. Now his mother had died in the meantime. Evidently he knew about this. There's no mentioning of her here, but she evidently had died in the meantime, so he wants to go to the land of Canaan. What's going to happen? It's rather interesting. Verse 19. And Laban went to shear his sheep And Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. Oh, that's interesting. Rachel had stolen the images. What do you mean she had stolen the images? Well, these are family idols. Family idols. What they were like, it's not known, but they were small, or Rachel could not have hid them as she did in verse 34. They had some kind of little idols. Evidently, Laban was an idol worshiper. He didn't worship the true God. This shows that Abraham's relatives were still idolaters and affirms that his family served idols in Babylon before settling in Haran. So Laban was not a child of God. He was a worshiper of idols. And they must have had an unusual little idol that the family had cherished all these years. And these girls, when they were growing up, evidently they came to this little idol and they prayed over it and they put a lot of faith in this little idol. And we find that Rachel goes in the tent and she steals it. It's rather interesting. Rachel, middle of verse 19, Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's, 20, and Jacob stole away unawares to Laban the Syrian, and that he told him not, that he fled. Jacob didn't want an argument because his uncle, Laban, had a lot of hired servants. He had sons. He had a large contingent of relatives, and so he didn't want an argument with them and all of this kind of business, because he thought, well, the best way to solve this problem is when my uncle goes over there to the shearing pit, over to the shearing shed, over to the tent where he's going to shear the sheep tomorrow. While he's over there, I'll just load up the camels and get going. We won't make a lot of noise. We'll just move on out. And I'll get a day or two journey on him before he discovers it. Evidently, that's what happened. Because it says, in the latter part of verse 20, that he told him not, that he fled. Jacob didn't announce to his uncle that he was going. Verse 21, so he fled with all that he had, and he rose up and passed over the river. Now, what do we mean over the river? Well, over the river Euphrates. Where's all this taking place? This is taking place over in what we now call Iran, in that part of the world. Over where the Tigris and the Euphrates River flow in that part of the world on its way down to the Persian Gulf. He was away over there 300 to 400 miles east of what is now the state of Israel. He's over in that part of the world. So he passed over the river and set his face toward the Mount Gilead. So there we have Jacob's journey to Canaan. And he's fleeing to get away from his uncle. Now what's going to happen? Well, the uncle's not going to let this pass by without an effort to stop him. How's he going to do it? In verses 22 through 29, we have Jacob is pursued by Laban. And the wonderful thing about it is that God protects him. Under all circumstances, God is able. Sometimes we don't know how God will protect. We don't see how God can protect. And we don't understand how God can protect, but God does. So here we have actually two sheep farmers. And one of them is settled down there in that part of the world, what is now the land of Iran, in what used to be Persia. And he's settled down, but his hired man with the two daughters, who are his two wives, with some 14 children approximately, are stealing away. They're going to leave the old fellow all behind. So we pick up our story in verse 22. And it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob was fled. Now that's interesting. The third day. Because Jacob, traveling, would be about, he would be somewhere, I would say in the neighborhood of 25 miles in 3 days. Possibly he could make 10 miles a day. Now this is a conjecture on my part. because he had these animals, he had these sheep, these goats, the cattle, and as they eat, as they travel along, they had to be watered. They bedded them down at night. And he's gone 3 days, but for some reason or other, you'll notice that God didn't let Laban know that he'd been gone until 3 days had passed. You know, that's rather interesting. There's a law among the Muslims that if you have an enemy, it's in one of the ancient books of the Muslim religion, if you have an enemy, you have to feed that enemy, you have to bed him, give him a place to sleep. But the next morning, though you're destined to kill him, the next morning you have to give him lunch and water, and you have to allow him to have at least a 1-day journey ahead of you before you can take out to try to catch him to kill him. Isn't that rather interesting? Now God is going to give Jacob a 3-day leeway before his uncle finds out he's gone. And it was told Laban on the 3rd day that Jacob was fled, and he took his brethren with him and pursued after him 7 days' journey. He took some of his hired help, some of his brothers, some of his sons, and they chased him for 7 days. Now, this could be about an average of some 43 miles a day on swift dromedaries. It would have taken Jacob 10 days at 30 miles a day with his family and stock. But here he's gotten on this peculiar sport model camel, the dromedary. And so he's chasing Jacob out across the desert. He pursues him, and then he overtakes him in the Mount Gilead. But notice how God protects him. We have, if you remember, we have Jacob in verse 21 set his face toward the Mount Gilead. Now we have Laban pursuing him in the Mount Gilead in verse 23. God protects him beginning in verse 24. And God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night. In the Old Testament, you find that God dealt with both saved and unsaved, sometimes in the same manner. The godly man Jacob in a dream, the ungodly man Laban in a dream, verse 24. The Syrian in a dream by night, and said unto him, Take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. In other words, in our modern day vernacular, be careful what you do to Jacob. Watch yourself. Don't do him any harm. That's what he's saying. Verse 25. Then Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mount, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the Mount of Gilead, in the same area, north of Jerusalem, Mount Gilead, up in what is now Galilee, Gilead, verse 26. And Laban said to Jacob, What hast thou done? Laban talking to Jacob, What hast thou done that thou hast stolen away unawares to me and carried away my daughters as captives taken with the sword? How come you just stole my daughters like you just went in and took them like a bunch of thieves? Like you were a bandit or something. Well, he forgot that these women are his wives. It's rather interesting. See, this uncle is building up a case against Jacob because he wants to smother him with a lot of false arguments here, thinking that he can get the better side of him. But Laban doesn't understand that God is refereeing this whole match. God is calling the shots under this circumstance. Verse 27. Wherefore, Laban talking, Wherefore didst thou flee away secretly? How come you left under cover of night, or left early in the morning? How come? You left secretly, and steal away from me, and didst not tell me that I might have sent thee away with mirth, and with songs, and with tabret, and with harp. You see, If you had told me you were leaving, we would have thrown a big going away party. He's a liar. He didn't mean that. He's a slick boy. He's a clever. Oh, this guy is very clever, this Laban. Yeah, if you had told me why, we would have thrown a big going away party. We'd have brought in the orchestra. We would have had the harp, the tabret. We would have had 6-packs, all kinds of things. We would have had wine, and we would have we'd have had a barbecue. Oh, I'm telling you, we'd have had whoppers. We'd have had everything. We'd have had a real shindig for you. I don't trust him myself. I don't believe he meant that. Notice what he says in verse 28. And hast not suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters. Now he's referring to his grandsons and his granddaughters, the children. In other words, the little ones. He's saying, well, you didn't even let me kiss the little ones goodbye. Notice what it says. Thou hast now done foolishly in so doing. Verse 29. It is in the power of my hand to do you hurt. The old man is saying to Jacob, I have the power to do you hurt. I can cause trouble for you. What does he say? But notice the latter part of verse 29. But the God of your father spake unto me yesternight, saying, isn't that beautiful? Last night, while Laban and his group were chasing Jacob, God came and dealt with him in a dream. And now the old man is acknowledging that, and he says, but the God of your father spake unto me last night, saying, take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob, either good or bad. Providential care. Way back in the Old Testament. What's providential care? God is always watching out for us. I tell the story of the butterfly that flew in at the open window. And the maid came and she put the window down because she was dusting the furniture. She had freshened the room up, so she put the window down. And the butterfly was inside, and the butterfly couldn't get out because the maid had put the window down. And so the butterfly was flying up and down the window pane, wondering why he didn't get out and why he couldn't get out. And here comes a bird, and the bird sees the butterfly, and it's a bird that eats butterflies, and the butterfly is going up and down, and the bird's trying to get the butterfly, and the butterfly's wondering, how come the bird doesn't get me, and the bird's wondering, how come I don't get the butterfly? Invisible protection. Providential care. God. G-O-D. God protects. God cares for us. God watches over us. You'll say, well, how come plane crashes and the people are all killed? Well, you must remember, my friends, it is appointed unto man once to die. Book of Hebrews tells us that. It's appointed unto man once to die. All of us are going to die someday. And the only exception I make to that is, if we're living at the time of the translation of the church, some of us will never taste physical death. But basically speaking, all mankind has to die. But providential care, a pane of glass, invisible protection, a heavenly insurance policy with a premium constantly paid up in full. And that protection is always there and you can't rule it out. And God protected Jacob from Laban. Why? Jacob's the father, going to be the father of 12 sons. Who are the 12 sons? They're going to become the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Because God said to Abraham, way over in the 12th chapter, the book of Genesis, I'm going to give you the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession. He told him about the land in the 15th chapter, verse 18 of Genesis. He tells exactly where the land is. And then in the 17th chapter, he says, I'm going to cause your posterity to be as the stars of heaven and as the sand by the seashore. And God cannot lie under no circumstances. So he has to protect Jacob. And so he says to Laban, who is angry, with Jacob. He says to him in a dream, don't you touch Jacob. And that's all that's necessary. If God says don't touch, don't touch. Same thing with the 3 Hebrew children in the fiery furnace. God says don't burn, don't burn. Same thing with Daniel in the lion's den. Lions don't eat, they don't eat. You see, if you got God on your side, you don't need anybody else. If God be for you, who can be against you? Nobody.
You have heard Dr. Howard C. Estep present 2 messages from the book of Genesis, covering chapter 30 through chapter 31, verse 29. This Bible study series from the book of Genesis will continue on cassette number 15.